Looking at the housing crisis devastating Ontario, we're witnessing something unprecedented. Entire cities that once thrived are now facing a slow, painful death. The numbers are staggering, the stories heartbreaking, and what's happening in these tin cities should be a wake-up call for every Canadian. Let's dive into the harsh reality of Ontario's crumbling urban landscape. Number 10. Thunder Bay. Thunder Bay is bleeding residents faster than a punctured balloon loses air. This northwestern Ontario city has become the poster child for urban decay in our province. But here's what most people don't realize. It's not just about economics anymore, it's about survival. The city's population has dropped by over 8% in the last decade alone. That might not sound catastrophic until you understand what's driving families away. Housing costs have somehow managed to skyrocket even as the city empties out, creating this bizarre economic paradox where fewer people means higher prices. A modest two-bedroom apartment that cost $800 5 years ago now demands $1,400 monthly, while the median household income has barely budged. But here's where it gets really disturbing. The young people aren't just leaving for better opportunities, they're fleeing. Recent graduates from Lakehead University pack their bags before their diplomas are even dry. They've watched their older siblings struggle to find decent work that pays enough to cover rent, let alone save for a house. The brain drain is so severe that local businesses can't find qualified workers, creating a death spiral that's accelerating every month. The psychological impact on longtime residents is devastating. Imagine watching your neighborhood slowly empty out, seeing "for rent" signs multiply like weeds, and knowing that your property value is plummeting while your taxes keep climbing. These aren't just statistics, they're real families watching their life savings evaporate as their community crumbles around them. The most heartbreaking part? Thunder Bay still has so much potential, but the housing crisis has created such a toxic environment that even people who love the city feel forced to abandon it. And what's happening here is just the beginning of our countdown. Number 9. North Bay. North Bay's transformation into a ghost town is happening so gradually that many residents don't even realize they're living through an economic apocalypse. But here's the terrifying truth. This city of 50,000 is shrinking at a rate that would make economists panic if they were paying attention. The housing market here has entered what experts quietly call a death spiral. Home prices have actually increased by 40% since 2020, but here's the catch: nobody can afford them anymore. The average house price now sits around $420,000 in a city where the average income is barely $45,000 annually. Do the math and you'll understand why young families are packing U-Hauls every weekend. What makes North Bay's situation particularly cruel is that it's happening to a city that did everything right. They diversified their economy, invested in education with Nipissing University, and maintained beautiful natural surroundings that should attract residents. Instead, they're watching their tax base erode as working-age adults flee to larger centers where their paychecks might actually cover basic living expenses. The ripple effects are becoming impossible to ignore. Local schools are consolidating classrooms, small businesses are closing due to lack of customers, and municipal services are being cut just when residents need them most. The city is caught in a vicious cycle where declining population means higher per capita costs for essential services, which drives up taxes and pushes even more people to leave. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of North Bay's decline is how it mirrors patterns we're seeing across smaller Ontario cities. This isn't an isolated incident. It's a preview of what's coming to communities across our province. And speaking of previews, wait until you see what's happening in our next city. Number 8. Timmins. Timmins is experiencing something that should terrify every Canadian, a complete economic ecosystem collapse disguised as a simple housing crisis. This mining town of 42,000 people is hemorrhaging residents so quickly that local officials have stopped publishing certain population statistics. And when you dig deeper, you'll understand why they're scared to reveal the full extent of the damage. Here's what makes Timmins unique and terrifying. Unlike other struggling cities, Timmins actually has decent-paying jobs thanks to the mining sector. Gold miners can earn $80,000 to $100,000 annually, which should be enough to build a comfortable life. Instead, these well-paid workers are choosing to commute hundreds of kilometers or leave the region entirely, rather than try to establish roots in a community where housing has become impossibly expensive and scarce. The numbers are absolutely staggering. A basic 3-bedroom house that miners could easily afford 5 years ago for $180,000 now costs upward of $350,000. But here's the really disturbing part. There are barely any houses for sale. The rental market has essentially collapsed, with vacancy rates below 1% and waiting lists for decent apartments stretching months into the future. This housing shortage is creating psychological trauma that goes beyond financial stress. Families are being forced to live in overcrowded conditions. Adult children are moving back in with elderly parents not by choice, but by necessity. And young couples are delaying starting families because they literally have nowhere to raise children. The social fabric of the community is unraveling thread by thread. What's happening in Timmins should serve as a warning to every resource-dependent community in Ontario. Even good jobs and strong local economies can't protect against the housing crisis when supply and demand get this far out of balance. The mining companies are starting to worry about their ability to attract and retain workers, which could trigger an economic collapse that makes the current housing crisis look manageable by comparison. And if you think Timmins has it bad, wait until you hear about the catastrophe unfolding in our next city. Number 7. Sault Ste. Marie. Sault Ste. Marie is dying, and the most heartbreaking part is that nobody seems to care enough to save it. This border city of 73,000 residents is experiencing a slow-motion economic catastrophe that should be front-page news across Canada, but instead, it's being ignored while families suffer in silence. The housing situation here has become so desperate that it's literally driving people across international borders. Canadian families who have lived in the Soo for generations are now considering moving to the American side just to find affordable housing. Think about that for a moment. Canadians are being priced out of their own country by a housing market that has completely detached from local economic reality. Here's where the story gets really disturbing. The average household income in Sault Ste. Marie is approximately $52,000 annually, but the average house price has climbed to over $380,000. That means the typical family would need to spend more than 7 times their entire annual income to buy a modest home. Even rent has become crushing. A decent 2-bedroom apartment now costs $1,600 monthly, consuming nearly 40% of the median household's gross income before taxes. The psychological impact on long-time residents is devastating beyond measure. These are families whose roots go back generations, who built their lives around steel production and forestry, who never imagined they'd be forced to choose between bankruptcy and abandoning their hometown. The stress is literally making people sick, with local healthcare providers reporting increased cases of anxiety and depression directly related to housing insecurity. But here's what should keep every Canadian awake at night. Sault Ste. Marie isn't some isolated economic basket case. This is happening to a city with decent infrastructure, natural beauty, and a strategic location. If the housing crisis can destroy a community like this, nowhere in Ontario is truly safe. The exodus is accelerating every month, and each family that leaves makes it harder for those who remain to maintain basic community services and economic viability. We're watching a death spiral in real time, and our next city shows us just how much worse things can get. Number 6. Sudbury. Sudbury's housing crisis has reached levels of absurdity that would be comedic if they weren't destroying lives. This mining city of 166,000 people is experiencing something unprecedented, a complete breakdown of the relationship between wages and housing costs that's forcing even well-paid professionals to live like college students well into their 30s and beyond. Here's a story that perfectly captures the insanity. A registered nurse with 8 years of experience, earning $75,000 annually, recently spent 14 months searching for a decent rental apartment. She eventually settled for a basement unit with no windows in the main living area, paying $1,800 monthly for the privilege of living like a mole. This isn't a struggling minimum wage worker. This is a healthcare professional with a secure, well-paying job who can't find basic housing in her own community. The rental market has become so competitive that landlords are demanding employment letters, credit reports, references, and often first and last month's rent, plus additional security deposits totaling thousands of dollars up front. Young professionals are being forced to compete against each other like they're applying for jobs, just for the right to pay outrageous rent for substandard housing. But here's where Sudbury's situation becomes truly frightening. The city depends heavily on mining professionals, engineers, and healthcare workers to maintain its economy and provide essential services. As these educated professionals get priced out or choose to leave, the community is losing the exact people it needs most to remain viable. Local hospitals are struggling to recruit specialists, and mining companies are having difficulty attracting the skilled workers they need to maintain operations. The social consequences are equally devastating. Young adults who grew up in Sudbury, who love their hometown and want to contribute to its future, are being forced to leave not because they lack good jobs, but because they can't find anywhere to live that doesn't consume their entire paycheck. Families are being torn apart as adult children move hundreds of kilometers away, leaving elderly parents without nearby support systems. What makes Sudbury's crisis particularly ominous is that this is supposed to be one of Ontario's success stories, a city that successfully diversified its economy and built resilience after previous economic downturns. If Sudbury can't solve its housing crisis, what hope do smaller, less economically diverse communities have? The answer to that question becomes clear when we look at our next city, where the situation has moved beyond crisis into complete catastrophe. Number 5, Sarnia. Now here's where our story takes a turn that will shock you to your core. Sarnia isn't just facing a housing crisis, it's experiencing something far more sinister that nobody wants to talk about publicly. This border city of 72,000 people has become ground zero for what housing economists privately call economic ethnic cleansing, where entire communities are being systematically priced out of their own neighborhoods. But before we dive into that disturbing reality, here's what makes Sarnia's situation absolutely mind-bending. This is a city with massive petrochemical plants, decent industrial jobs, and proximity to the American border. By every economic indicator, Sarnia should be thriving. Instead, it's experiencing a housing apocalypse so severe that local officials have stopped holding public meetings about housing policy because residents were becoming too angry and confrontational. The numbers alone will make your head spin. A basic starter home that cost $165,000 in 2019 now sells for over $450,000. That's not a typo. Home values have nearly tripled in just 5 years in a city where average incomes have increased by maybe 8% over the same period. But here's the really disturbing part. Much of this price inflation is being driven by investors from Toronto and Vancouver who are buying properties sight unseen, treating Sarnia's housing stock like a commodity rather than homes for actual families. The human cost is becoming impossible to ignore. Long-term residents who built their lives in Sarnia are being forced out by property tax increases that follow these inflated home values. Elderly residents on fixed incomes are losing homes they've owned for decades because they can't afford the tax bills. Young families are living in overcrowded conditions or commuting vast distances because rental prices have exploded beyond anything reasonable for local wages. But here's what should terrify every Canadian about Sarnia's situation. This is happening in a city with good jobs and decent infrastructure. If investor speculation can destroy housing affordability this quickly in Sarnia, imagine what's happening in communities with weaker economies and fewer employment opportunities. The psychological trauma is becoming a public health crisis. Local councillors report unprecedented demand for services related to housing stress, family breakups, and anxiety disorders. People are making impossible choices between paying rent and buying groceries, between staying in their hometown and maintaining financial stability. And here's the most chilling part. Sarnia's crisis is accelerating, not stabilizing. Each month brings new stories of families forced to leave, local businesses losing customers, and community organizations struggling to maintain volunteers as their membership base gets priced out of the area. What's happening in Sarnia should be a wake-up call for every Canadian, but instead, it's being treated as an isolated problem while the same forces are actively destroying communities across our province. And speaking of destruction, our next city will show you just how complete this devastation can become. Number 4, Windsor. Windsor is experiencing what can only be described as a complete economic and social breakdown disguised as urban development. This border city of 230,000 people should be benefiting from proximity to Detroit and a diversified economy, but instead it's becoming a cautionary tale about what happens when housing becomes a luxury good that ordinary working families can't afford. Here's a statistic that should make every Canadian furious. The average rent for a decent 2-bedroom apartment in Windsor has increased by 127% since 2020. Let that sink in for a moment. While wages have grown by maybe 10% over the same period, housing costs have more than doubled. This isn't market adjustment, this is systematic economic violence against working families. The situation has become so desperate that university students at the University of Windsor are living in cars, sleeping in 24-hour gyms, and couch surfing indefinitely because they literally cannot find housing they can afford in student budgets. But here's what makes this especially heartbreaking. Many of these students are local residents who grew up in Windsor and dreamed of getting an education in their hometown. Instead, they're being forced to choose between education and basic shelter. What's happening to working families is even worse. Teachers, nurses, police officers, and other essential workers are being forced to commute from communities an hour or more away because they can't afford to live where they work. The social fabric of the community is being shredded as the people who make the city function are priced out of participating in its daily life. But here's where Windsor's story becomes truly dystopian. The city is simultaneously experiencing rapid development and population decline among working families. Luxury condos and expensive housing developments are sprouting up everywhere, but they're pricing out the exact people who make the community vibrant and functional. It's like watching a city commit suicide while convincing itself it's experiencing growth. The ripple effects are devastating every aspect of community life. Local schools are losing enrollment as families move away. Small businesses are closing because their customer base has been priced out, and social organizations are struggling as volunteers relocate to more affordable areas. The city is becoming a hollow shell filled with expensive housing that serves investors rather than residents. Perhaps most disturbing is how quickly this transformation has happened. 5 years ago, Windsor was considered an affordable alternative to Toronto and other expensive Ontario cities. Today, it's becoming just as unaffordable while offering fewer employment opportunities and amenities. The speed of this change has left longtime residents feeling blindsided and betrayed by their own city government. And if you think Windsor's rapid deterioration is shocking, wait until you see what's happening in our next city, where the crisis has reached levels that seem almost impossible to believe. Number 3, Kingston. Kingston's housing crisis has reached levels of severity that are literally rewriting the demographics of one of Ontario's most historic cities. This university town of 132,000 people is experiencing what housing experts quietly describe as academic gentrification, where even the professors and staff who make the city's economy possible are being priced out of their own community. Here's a story that perfectly captures the insanity of Kingston's housing market. A tenured professor at Queen's University, earning over $90,000 annually, recently lost a bidding war on a modest 3-bedroom house to an investor who offered a $150,000 over asking price in cash without even viewing the property. Think about that. A successful academic with job security and a good income can't compete with speculative money flooding into the market from outside the community. The rental situation has moved beyond crisis into complete chaos. Students are sleeping in study carrels at the library because they can't find housing, and some are choosing to attend universities in other provinces rather than deal with Kingston's impossible rental market. But here's what should alarm everyone. If students with parental support and temporary housing needs can't find places to live, imagine what's happening to working families trying to build permanent lives in the community. The numbers are absolutely staggering and getting worse every month. The average rent for a one-bedroom apartment has climbed to over $1,900 monthly in a city where many service workers earn less than $2,500 monthly before taxes. Even two-income professional families are struggling to find housing that doesn't consume 60 or 70% of their combined income. But here's where Kingston's situation becomes particularly heartbreaking. This is a city with incredible history, beautiful architecture, and a strong sense of community identity. Longtime residents who have deep roots in Kingston's cultural and social fabric are being forced to abandon the city they love not because they want to leave, but because they literally cannot afford to stay. Number 2. Peterborough. Hold on to your seats, because what's happening in Peterborough represents the complete collapse of housing as a human right in Ontario. This city of 83,000 people has become the epicenter of a housing catastrophe so severe that it's literally killing people. And the most terrifying part is how quickly a once affordable community has been transformed into an economic war zone. Here's a fact that should make every Canadian's blood boil. Peterborough now has the highest eviction rate in all of Ontario, with families being thrown out of their homes at a pace that would be considered a humanitarian crisis if it were happening in any other country. But here's what makes this especially cruel. Many of these evictions aren't happening because families can't pay their rent. They're happening because landlords want to renovate properties and charge new tenants double or triple the current rent. The homeless population has exploded by over 400% in just 3 years. But here's what the statistics don't capture. These aren't just individuals struggling with addiction or mental health issues. These are working families, seniors on fixed incomes, and young adults with jobs who literally cannot find housing they can afford anywhere in the region. The face of homelessness in Peterborough has completely changed, and it looks disturbingly like middle-class Canada. The rental market has become so predatory that it resembles something from a dystopian nightmare. Landlords are demanding 6 months' rent up front, employment letters, credit scores above 750, and personal references just for the privilege of paying $2,200 monthly for a basic 2-bedroom apartment. Young professionals with good jobs are being rejected for rentals because they don't meet increasingly ridiculous qualification requirements. But here's where Peterborough's story becomes absolutely heartbreaking. This was supposed to be Ontario's affordable alternative. People moved here from Toronto and other expensive cities specifically because they could afford to buy homes and raise families. Now those same families are being forced to leave Peterborough to find affordable housing in even smaller, more remote communities. The speed of this transformation has left residents feeling traumatized and betrayed. Home prices have increased by over 180% since 2019, while local incomes have barely moved. Families who thought they had found stability and community in Peterborough are discovering that nowhere is safe from speculative investment and housing financialization. The human cost is becoming impossible to ignore. Local emergency rooms are treating increased numbers of patients for stress-related conditions directly tied to housing insecurity. Children are changing schools multiple times per year as families are forced to move constantly in search of affordable housing. The social disruption is so severe that community organizations are struggling to maintain programs because their client base is constantly being displaced. What makes Peterborough's crisis particularly terrifying is how it demonstrates that the housing apocalypse can consume any community, regardless of size or previous affordability. If Peterborough can be transformed this quickly from a refuge into a crisis zone, every community in Ontario should be afraid of what's coming next. And that brings us to our number 1 city, where everything we've discussed reaches its absolutely devastating conclusion. Number 1. Oshawa. Oshawa represents the complete and total failure of housing policy in Ontario. And what's happening here should terrify every Canadian because it proves that even cities with strong industrial bases and good employment opportunities can be utterly destroyed by housing financialization. This city of 175,000 people has become ground zero for the most comprehensive housing catastrophe in Ontario's history. Here's a statistic that will make you question everything you thought you knew about Canadian housing. The average house price in Oshawa has increased by 267% since 2016, while the median household income has increased by just 12% over the same period. This isn't market correction or economic adjustment. This is systematic wealth extraction that's destroying the lives of working families who built this community. But here's what makes Oshawa's situation uniquely devastating. This was supposed to be the success story. After the decline of automotive manufacturing, the city worked hard to diversify its economy and maintain good middle-class jobs. General Motors workers, skilled tradespeople, and other industrial workers earned solid incomes that should have guaranteed comfortable lives. Instead, they're watching their life savings evaporate as housing costs consume everything they earn. The human stories coming out of Oshawa read like economic horror fiction. Families who bought modest homes for $180,000 10 years ago are now facing property tax bills based on assessments over $600,000. Senior citizens who worked their entire lives to pay off their mortgages are being forced to sell their homes because they can't afford the property taxes on their fixed incomes. This is economic warfare against ordinary families, disguised as market forces. The rental market has become completely dysfunctional. A basement apartment that rented for $900 in 2019 now commands $2,400 monthly, if you can find one available. Young adults who grew up in Oshawa and want to start their careers in their hometown are being forced to live with parents indefinitely or leave the city entirely. The community is losing an entire generation of potential leaders and innovators. But here's what should keep every Canadian awake at night. Oshawa's crisis is spreading outward like a cancer. As families get priced out of Oshawa, they're moving to smaller communities and driving up housing costs there. The housing apocalypse that started in Toronto and Vancouver has now consumed Oshawa so completely that it's metastasizing to every surrounding community. The psychological trauma is becoming a public health emergency. Local healthcare providers report unprecedented demand for mental health services related to housing stress. Families are breaking apart under the financial pressure. Children are changing schools constantly as parents chase affordable housing, and longtime residents are experiencing symptoms similar to war refugees, because they essentially are refugees in their own country. What makes Oshawa's situation particularly ominous is how it demonstrates that nowhere in Ontario is safe from housing financialization. If a city with decent jobs, good infrastructure, and proximity to major markets can be destroyed this quickly and completely, every community in our province is vulnerable to the same fate. The most heartbreaking part is that Oshawa still has all the ingredients for success: good jobs, decent infrastructure, and hardworking families who want to build lives in their community. But the housing crisis has made it impossible for the city to function as anything other than a commodity. For investors who have never set foot in the community and don't care about the families they're displacing. These 10 cities represent more than just individual housing crises. They're showing us the complete breakdown of housing as a basic human need in Ontario. From Thunder Bay to Oshawa, we're watching communities that took generations to build being destroyed in just a few years by policies that prioritize investor profits over human dignity. The question isn't whether this crisis will spread to other communities. It's how quickly it will consume everything we've built in this province. What do you think about these cities and their struggles? Which situation shocked you the most, and do you see solutions that could help these communities recover? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below.